Welcome, everyone, to Misguided the podcast, where we explore how our psychology shapes what we believe, what we share, and how trust in the information around us is built. I'm your host, Matthew Facciani, and today I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Patrick Johnson. Patrick is a journalism scholar at Marquette University whose work focuses on news literacy, trust in journalism, and how media institutions build or lose trust with the communities they serve. A former high school journalism teacher, he studies why trust in journalism varies so much across groups and what news organizations can actually do to meaningfully engage the public. In this conversation, we explore why rebuilding trust in journalism requires more than better communication strategies or fact-checking. Patrick shares insights from his research on local news and community engagement and introduces what he calls metacognitive news literacy, the idea that journalists themselves must model transparency and critical thinking to rebuild credibility. We also discuss the surprising parallels between journalism and public health, the role of relationships in building lasting trust, and why Patrick remains genuinely hopeful about the future of journalism despite today's challenges. Let's dive into it. Patrick, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to see you again. And I'm really looking forward to learning more about your work.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So before we dive into what you're doing now, I often like to ask people how they got to the point to where they are today. And I know that you spent time teaching high school and teaching journalism before moving into academia and the university system. So I was just curious if you could just share a little bit more about that process. What was that like from being a teacher and then moving to a university setting?
Yeah, I think what makes my career super special, and I don't mean that as if I'm special, but special as in unique, is that I got to spend some of the most formative years of my career cultivating who I am with the humans that I now kind of really think about how to make their lives better. And I really had always wanted to be a teacher ever since I was in third grade. I wanted to be a teacher. Miss Rooney is still to this day someone who I connect with and talk to when I can. And so teaching was inherently in my bones. And being a journalism teacher also has been inherently in my bones. Journalism has been part of my DNA. It's been stained on my fingers since I was 3. I love to tell the story of my mom and I lived with my grandparents growing up. And my grandma and I would sit at the kitchen table and she would read the Chicago Tribune and I would read the high school newspaper. And that's how I learned to read. And their newsprint would rub off on my fingertips. And so I would have stained fingertips. And that became my introduction to literacy, to learning, to journalism. And what ultimately would happen years later, after being on the high school newspaper, being the editor-in-chief of the paper, doing the college newspaper, college magazine, television, I returned back home to my hometown high school where my entire family went, and actually advised the newspaper that I learned to read from. And so the time I spent getting to be in that classroom was the time I got to learn what media really does do, the importance of journalism, not just on communities, but on kids, the importance of how they can be a part of the process, why they should be part of the process. The town I grew up in, the town of the paper I advised, they were the newspaper. As the local ecosystem has changed and shifted, and this was 2013 is when I started teaching there. Even then it started to shift. And so they were the news of the town. And so they had this burden and they were the shoulders that the news carried. And so it was an opportunity to really fall in love with what I now get to study and think about in a totally different way. And that's what got me to eventually getting my PhD and thinking about news literacy and journalism practice from K-12 to higher ed to the profession.
Great. Yeah, that's such a great story. It's all comes full circle. And it's amazing you're able to share that with your students that you have in your college classes, but then also, take those lessons that you learned from your own experience as being a student and then teaching students at the high school level. And then what I find really cool about your research is how you dive into the journalism as an institution and thinking how they have a relationship with their communities. And I was, a lot for me, whenever I do my research on media literacy and from this social science perspective, it's often more like static, kind of like using media as sources. And you don't really do like this critical analysis of how journalism as institutions function and have relationships with their communities. So I think that's really cool. You kind of dive into that. And I was wondering if you just share a little bit more about that process. Like, what does that mean? What is some of your research findings? What have they dove into? What is most interesting to you these days?
One of the things that I think is amazing about what we get to do, and what I love to tell my grad students, but what I also love to tell my undergrads, is when I was an undergrad at Marquette, which is where I now teach. So when you say full circle moments, I have a lot of them in my life, is I didn't have someone who looked like me, who came from a background like me, who talked like me. I was a first gen student. I was in the closet. I grew up economically disadvantaged. And so I didn't know what any of this could be. I wouldn't even have known what journalism institutions would have meant. I just knew that I could advise newspaper, and that was going to be super cool. And that I was going to have an impact on kids' lives like my high school journalism teacher would have an impact on mine. And so when I talk to my undergrads, when I talk to my grad students, what I love to tell them is I get to play every day thinking about how to make the world better by thinking very critically about this like little niche system. And for me, that's the institution of journalism. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about it in three ways. I think about it in terms of its literacy, its practice, and its education, and how those three things intersect with one another. More so, I think about, whereas you do a lot of media literacy work with the people themselves, I actually think a lot about the literacy of the journalists themselves, which I'm sure we'll talk about. When I do practice work or educational work, a lot of that is, as you've alluded to, it has a lot to do with the communities themselves, and how journalism actually interacts and intersects with them. And specifically, I do a lot of work with people who are distrustful of the press, people who are considered marginalized by the press, or who have just been historically contentious with the press. And so get to really ponder a lot about, for example, why conservatives have traditionally walked away from journalism despite having a really substantial ecosystem in radio and cable. Why Black and Brown communities, despite having a really strong information ecosystem, have walked away from the news. Right now, and a lot of my work is about LGBTQ communities and why they're incredibly avoidant because of harm. And so that's been the fruit of my labor right now. I'm happy to go deeper based on whatever you want to ask me. But yeah, so I get to spend a lot of really cool time thinking about, well, I guess it's not always cool because usually it's about journalism how they harmed them, but it gets to make journalism better. And I guess that's why it's cool.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to dive into it and dive into those nuances and understand how it works before we can try to hopefully rebuild and make things a little bit better. So yeah, let's dive into it a little bit more. Like, what does it look like to analyze trust from a journalistic perspective? Like, how do they? I guess if you want to give a high level overview of some of the things that what sort of things went wrong, and then what sort of things can we begin to think about in order to rebuild that trust or even build that trust that never was there in the first place?
So one of the things that is really important for, I think, both of us to think about in the work we do, what more academics need to think about, what the profession needs to think about, is trust in itself is not monolithic. And oftentimes I think we try to categorize it as such, as if we're going to just be able to solve it by addressing the misinformation problem, or addressing the politicization problem, or addressing polarization, or let's reduce costs and people will come back. But what I've been able to learn is we have to think differently about the communities, and we have to change the ways in which we serve communities. So the way I think about journalism is I think about it as a public service, which isn't new. It's not unique that I think of it this way. But the reason I think of it this way, and I think what makes the way I think of it unique, is I like to tell people that journalists are the second greatest educators in the world, next to teachers. And if we see them and we treat them as educators, then the idea of public service changes. It becomes something that is not simply informational, but educational. And we see those two words differently in society. We see their mission differently. We see one more vocational, for example. Vocational in terms of calling, not vocational in terms of maybe schooling. And so when we think about education, sometimes education means we have to be accessible and accessible in different ways. We have to think about how we engage, and we have to engage in different ways. And so, for example, one of the things we've learned with Black and Brown communities is they don't want to constantly have these stereotypes being the essential image that is framed of them. They feel as though every story being used of them, particularly with the Black community, is tied to economic disadvantage or violence, particularly gun violence or gang violence. For our Latino community, they don't want to constantly have every story be about immigration about them. Or for them, what we've learned a lot about is why is news not being sometimes delivered or interviews being delivered in Spanish language so that many of them can be served differently? And this kind of work I get to do in collaboration with Trusting News, which is a nonprofit organization. And it's one of my greatest partnerships I have. It's one of my joys in my career. And because of that, we also get to study people like conservatives who don't want the loudest person in the room to be their voice. And they're really sick of all being collapsed under a 4-letter mantra. And conservatives want to be identified differently. Those who are in more rural communities don't believe they're the same type of conservative than someone who is in a city. People have different purposes. And now my work is very focused on LGBTQ individuals, and their avoidance and their distrust is incredibly historically built. And it has a lot to do with queer panic and a lack of context and a lack of explanation and journalism using monolithic terminology and journalism being incredibly harmful about who they put forward for the story. And so they're all different. While you can kind of maybe say you can paint a broad swath of don't use monolithic terminology, know your context. If you genuinely care, then we need to treat these communities differently, and we need to have newsrooms engage differently. That means more time, more energy, more money, which I know is counter to what we have right now in the industry. But it's going to make the institution better, and it's going to make trust earned versus given.
Yeah, I appreciate that because broader, whenever we have these discussions about trust in different spaces, it can reduce trust as a concept that is a checkbox on a survey form. It's like, do you trust us? Yes, no. And it's like, okay, well, how do we get more yeses? And it's not very granular or appreciative of, like you said, the diversity of different groups, even within, not even looking at different groups, but then looking at the diversity within those diverse groups, I think is just something that is missed across social science broadly, but then also various institutions. And it is challenging because, as you mentioned, a lot of this is like, okay, like you can map it out, like you're mapping out some of these areas of improvement. And it's like getting to that solution stage requires some amount of time and money to allow for a foundation of making all the improvements that you just mentioned.
I will for sure never be one to call myself an economist. That is for sure. But I think what we have to do is be more innovative in the ways in which we can work together to figure out outcomes. We've spent a lot of time historically in journalism, in our own silos, in our own corners, in competition with one another, and we just don't have the capacity to do that anymore. If we're going to serve communities better, we're going to need to start working together differently. And that might mean sharing resources differently. That might mean figuring out different pathways to support one another in different economic ways. I think one of the things that you saw that was super interesting about 2 months ago was you saw a ad come out in the Daily podcast about supporting local news. And that's the first time ever you saw an ad from the publisher come out directly from the Times in the podcasting world, at least in their own podcasting. I think there is a sense of how important the local news infrastructure really is coming from them, because ultimately, and it is a question of economics, but economics can't be the only thing. If local news doesn't exist, the national news will not gain trust back at all, because our data shows, and it's not just my data, it's journalism studies folks across the country, across the world. The more removed a news source is from a community, the less likely someone is to trust it. The way we rebuild trust is the more local the information source it is. So if places like the New York Times or Reuters or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post want to rebuild trust in their infrastructure, they have to rely on the fact that local news needs to exist. And if we want to continue to sustain economic infrastructures within our communities, as well as social and civic infrastructures within our communities, we have to have local news exist. And so if we just continue to isolate the arguments, as we kind of have, and I think generally the argument journalistically in the industry has been economic, we're not going to solve the problem. And I think we saw the civic argument over the last election. And clearly when we relied just on that argument, that didn't work either. And so until we're willing to actually sit with this idea of where does context fit with circulation, with consumption, with the ways in which local needs to work with national, with international, which almost means redoing the system, and that's never going to happen. We're going to have much more significant conversations. But until then, some of these large organizations are going to need to pony up and recognize how significant it is that these local operations need to exist, and that does not mean buying them up with a hedge fund.
Yeah. And it's like if they are more mindful of the long-term effects of ignoring the importance of locality, it's in their best interest too. So it's kind of like a short-term versus long-term, even if you're just looking at it from a economics or self-interest perspective. And that's consistent with what we find in health communication. I mean, people trust sources of information when they're closer to them or they believe they're part of their group. That's why people trust their personal doctor more than health institutions more broadly. And I mean, health institutions, you mentioned the civics argument, like it's hard to try and defend it's hard to make an argument to a broad audience that we need to defend these institutions and support these institutions if historically or currently the institutions are not working for them very well. So that's like a broader issue of like trying to be, okay, we need to rebuild journalism. It's like, okay, well, what if we don't like journalism as how it's working right now? Then you're not going to care about it. Same with, any sort of institutions, the university systems, like, oh, universities are struggling. Well, if you think the universities hasn't served your interests, then you might not care about that. So some of it is like a communication of the field and reaching out to different communities and learning how we can do better, building partnerships, better communicating what value we have. But then also the point you mentioned earlier is like something very practical as far as like, okay, we may not be able to pour money into this, or maybe we can get certain big companies or platforms to, give shout outs to smaller local platforms. But something that I think we've also talked about before is like just the power of interdisciplinary work, multidisciplinary work. Instead of having people reinvent the wheel and using all their resources to do something that someone already did, you just leverage your networks. Like that's basically free, is leveraging networks better. And that's something that I think institutions and academics, journalists can all certainly do a better job.
Yeah, I think where a more engagement model of journalism really does do well is it seeks to really rethink how journalism interacts with the audience and allows community members to be far more part of the conversation, which I think allows that interdisciplinarity to exist. If we're going to use that term, like we would use it academically, but if we want to use it communally, I think what it says is journalism is an information gatherer as well, that not only are we an arbiter of truth and an educator of news and information, we are a gatherer of information, meaning we are meant to bring people to the public square to have this conversation. And so that could mean that journalism really does think really critically about moving forward, learning how to host and hosting things like public education events where they're bringing in people from different places and to sit down and have thoughts about what does it mean to do X, Y, and Z? How do you have a problem? How do you do a FOIA request to solve it? Are all having issues with housing in this area? Let's bring in a housing expert. Let's bring in someone who's a landlord. Let's bring in this and let's have a conversation. Let's bring in resources from the community to sit down at tables. I'm not saying bring in a keynote that's going to cost $10,000. Like newspapers already don't have money. That's not the way to do it. But it's finding other people who also have some of that capital within the community that also can bolster the trust within the news organization. Because when you bring in those folks that have that power within the community to say, yeah, we are working in partnership with this news organization. Yes, we do believe this news organization has our community's best interest in mind, and that's why I'm here at this panel. I'm here to support this event. That's going to go a long way. That's going to help build community. That's going to help build an information ecosystem that really does matter. It means allowing journalists to post up, say, in a coffee shop and publicly say, hey, I'm not actually here to interview. I'm actually here to sit and listen and do listening sessions. Sue Robinson, who's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I worked with journalists to just do listening sessions where they just sat and they heard about what their community members felt about journalism and why they were having problems with the news and why they weren't subscribing with the news. And that's really powerful. And what happened? Over 70% felt they were, or 70% of them felt they would subscribe. And that's a big deal. And so if we create these systems where we're changing the ecosystem, we're starting from the ground up, but maybe also seeing some help from the top down, maybe it does change the ways that we can improve the information ecosystem overall, but also hopefully build some more trust in journalism again.
Yeah, I think so. I think it would. And it connects to what I've been thinking about from a public health perspective of doing similar things where you have physicians, healthcare professionals, scientists do a similar kind of listening session or a town hall. Like I don't really know any events like this where it's just you have people, the experts, quote unquote, not just give a keynote talk like you're saying, but actually have a discussion being like, okay, I've spent, 10, 20 years in this field. What can I do that's actually helpful? Like what health concerns do you have? What concerns or questions do you have about vaccines? And then they can offer their perspective, like as a physician, XYZ, as a university professor, scientist, this is my perspective. And then you're seeing each other's perspectives and like not only learning, because a lot of people, again, because trust is so social, if you don't know personally any physicians and the only experience you have is maybe with, the physician you might see every couple of years, it's really easy to distrust physicians as a field or as a whole. So one of that's just like the social relationship building aspect. And then there's also just listening and hearing their perspective. Like maybe you didn't know about the funding issues that they had. Or if you think doctors are in it for the money, and then you actually talk to one and you're like, they're not getting any more money based on how many vaccines they give. And just hearing that directly from a doctor can be really powerful. Again, for me, I've been thinking a lot about in this public health angle, but I think a lot of it would apply to journalism as well.
It 100% would. Think journalism and public health, interestingly, have evolved in parallel ways. I mean, you can go all the way back to, say, like the Spanish flu, where you saw an increase in trust in public health. You also saw an increase in trust in journalism, and that's also when the idea of objectivity evolved. And so objectivity, though, evolved then as a concept of scientific method, which, again, evolved parallel to health being the way it was. But much like what you're talking about, if someone is not consistently communicating with a health professional or having a health professional who cultivates a relationship with them, there's less trust in the industry of health, of public health. The same thing applies to journalism. When 80% of people have never interacted with a journalist, and most likely the people who have interacted with a journalist are white, male, straight, and elite, there's clearly going to be some concerns about trusting those particular individuals. And when you have that particular parallel between these two institutions, and when you see that, for example, in 2020, you see a very stark decline in trust in both. And when both are mission critical to civic engagement, civic responsibility, and civic wellness, what then occurs is a substantial rise in mis and disinformation and public disorder. And so, again, you can track that all the way back to the early 1900s. Journalism and public health are kissing cousins in ways that I don't think people pay enough attention to. When one goes down in trust, so does the other. And when one goes up, so does the other. And so if we spend more time thinking and talking to one another in ways that we don't already do, because I don't think we do a lot, and you and I have talked about that, I actually think we might find ways forward to really addressing some of our problems of civic unrest. Because if we can't address, it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, let's be real. Our two professions literally fill some of that basic need, knowledge and wellness. And if we don't have those things, people just believe whatever is in front of their face, and then we have trouble.
Right. Or, yeah, there's an opportunity for bad actors or people with motives to fill that space by behaving without scruples, so to say. So yeah, I really like how you presented that because it connects journalism and public health in ways that I don't think are discussed enough, and I think it'd be helpful to people to reflect on that. And I was wondering if you could just dive into this even a bit more because I know you have written about this academically, the term metacognitive news literacy behavior. I mean, that's a very, academic term. So I was wondering if you could break that down. Like, what does this mean in practice? Like, the journalists actually modeling the behavior of news literacy in a way that can build trust.
Yes, that is the academician in me for sure. It's just a fancy word to say, I believe that journalists need to be literate of their own profession. And I was thinking a lot about when we go, for example, to get an oil changed, or in our car, we want someone who understands how to change oil. If I want a good bottle of wine, I want a sommelier who knows a good bottle of wine. If we're going to an expert, we want them to be an expert. And we want them to be able to talk us through why they're an expert, the process of what they're doing, of how they're doing it when we go to the doctor. My doctor can walk me through the process of what's happening, why it's happening in my body, and not just why it's happening in my body, but what he is going to do to help me understand that process and what he's going to do to my body to get me through that process. If one of the baseline definitions of news literacy is to think and act like a journalist, then should not our assumption be that journalists should be news literate? And so about 4 years ago at this point, I asked that question and did a survey of 238 journalists, 250 journalists. Journalists don't love to do surveys. And on average, they're pretty average. They're about mid 80s, 80%. Now you break it down demographically. The older the journalist, the less news literate they are. The more conservative the journalist, the less news literate they are. And it got me to think, well, why? Why is that the case? And so I wanted to figure out how can we make then the profession more news literate? And how can we then think about how do we improve behaviors then of our citizenry? And so if we want to have news literate behaviors like being able to assess credibility, for example, and in that term, news literate behaviors, I give all the credit to Emily Varaga and colleagues, all of them of which who mentor me. That is all them. But I wanted to think about it as how did the journalists then do that so that they can provide those kind of behaviors to individuals, but also that those are mentored to others. And so the metacognition piece is then how do journalists talk through and reflect on and adapt those behaviors in their own practice. And so that includes things like transparency. Recently I had a piece out about relationship building. I have one that's coming about the law and how they enact legal literacy as a form of metacognitive news literacy behavior. I'm working on one about safety. I'm working on one about translation relative to using corporate social responsibility in business language and how they translate that kind of work. And then I'm also working on one about readability. And so how journalists are able to think about their audience and how their audience reads things and reading scores and Likert and all that kind of stuff. And so it's just how they think about their thinking in regards to the practice of journalism and then the means of which they do it.
Yeah, that's super cool. I like that approach of understanding how they present their process and go through their process and learning about that. And yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, they don't want to maybe take that survey and showcase that. Or maybe they have yeah, you mentioned like, do you think there's some skepticism even among journalists to kind of interact with academics? Is that kind of what's going on?
There's a group of us who 2 years ago, I think 2 years ago at this point, maybe it was last year, worked on a report for the American Press Institute about the journalism academic practice research gap.
Hmm.
And about how really there's just like this, journalists just don't like to talk to us. But my entire research agenda is dependent on talking to them. I don't spend a lot of time looking at texts. I don't spend a lot of time experimentally. Most of my life is dedicated to doing newsroom reconstruction. And so I just sit down with them and I ask them to walk me through what they're doing and why, which is one of the coolest things in the world. Like I get to talk to some of the most amazing people from the Northeast to the Southwest to the heart of the Midwest, from the biggest publications in the world to the smallest one-man operations. And I just get to hear why they do what they do and how they do it. And so that requires me to have a lot of trust with them. And it requires them to believe in me. And it's not that I'm trying to paint a picture that's negative, and I think that's where some of historically that issues become. Journalism studies as a discipline has not always been the nicest to journalists. I don't think academia has been the nicest to journalism. And so I'm not painting a rosy picture by any means, especially on the other side of my work. When I do my LGBTQ work, it is not nice to the discipline. But when I talk to these journalists, the way I frame it is my whole goal is to make our training and development experiences, our educational experiences better. And so when I'm thinking about relationship building, and I'm trying to understand how does it emerge across what we call the 5 Cs, or the 5 domains of news literacy that my mentor, my good friend Melissa Tully and her colleagues developed. How does relationship building emerge across content, context, creation, circulation, and consumption? And once it does that, where does it then emerge relative to norms? And how does that then showcase in different kinds of components? And how does it become approximate behavior so that it isn't just outcome driven? Because I think it's what makes what I do very unique. We like to think about behaviors, at least when we think of them definitionally, by outcomes. And because I tend to do a lot of, I don't want to call it theory building because I don't think that's what I'm doing. Other people would argue with me, but I don't think that's what I'm doing. But when I'm thinking through these ideas, what I'm trying to do is find ways for us to think differently about news literacy so that it can help us to train high school journalists in some way, that it also can train collegiate journalists, that it also can impact training and development of the profession. And so that ultimately across that pipeline, when you're training all of these individuals on these ideas that are meant to be reflexive, that are meant to speak directly to the public, that are also meant to teach the public how to do these things, that all of a sudden, if you're speaking to all of these generations by improving our own education and our own interactions with one another, my hope is it just makes us news literate and better as a society. And I know that is so pie in the sky. I am a blissful optimist as a human being, but I just can't imagine a better gift I can give than to impact education. Not that I don't want to impact knowledge production. I think that's great too. But so much of what I want to do is help change our cultures of practice so that we can be better, that it also helps make our communities better.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. And I think it's okay to be pie in the sky. I think I mean, I don't know. I try to be optimistic, and I think it's nice to have some optimism in the world sometimes. But I'm curious, like your own experience of meeting all these journalists and being in all these newsrooms, like you're kind of like your own, that's kind of like the psychologist in me is like thinking, how did that affect your own thoughts of the press and your own views towards trustworthiness of journalism as a practice? Like, do you feel, I'm sure it's become more complicated over the years as you learn more, but like, how has that process been when you first started doing this and meeting all of these people to where you are now?
I think most people would assume my answer would be I became more cynical, but it's not. I have fallen in love with my job more and more every journalist I speak to. But I want to take that to the thing I started with. It's because I continue to get ink-stained fingers. And I think it's because I have a love of literacy. When I get to meet these journalists, I don't become cynical of the institution. I get to hear them talk about why they want it to be better. I get to hear them be like, okay, so here's why I wrote the lead the way I did. And I wanted to put this first because, I mean, these people, they know this person. And I get that like other people don't know this person, but like this person is a really big deal in the community. And that's why this person needed to be first. Okay. And then sure, like talk me through like, why did this source come first in the story? Well, this person, they were so hard to get. And so it took me like months just to get this interview. So like, I just really wanted that one to go first. Like their heart and soul is in the work that they're doing, and the system is not necessarily helping them. And for as much as I would love the system to be better, I love journalism more every day. And I think it's ultimately because I know what the power of what it can do. I firmly believe that these journalists, like I said, are the second greatest educators in the world. I think of all of the wonderful things that AI is doing right now, for example. The images that are everywhere, the fake stories, the posts, the you name it. Who is better right now to be educators on all of these things than a journalist? Like, set it up, tell the story, give people the knowledge they need to break that down. My colleague Lynn Walsh, who's at Trusting News, has been doing this great work on AI literacy right now and trying to train journalists on how to be the leaders in their communities on being teachers of AI. And you know what? These people want to do it and they see the power of it. And so it gives me just tremendous optimism every time I talk to them, even though sometimes it's really sad when they're like, I don't know if I have a job next week. And then I'm sitting there being like, yeah, I have a cushy job in an institution at a university. But I think of what I do and the work I do and the way in which I can train people and find better ways to do what we do. Maybe someday I can help stop the firing because we made a better pipeline to get people to come back.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And again, I I keep thinking of all these parallels to public health as far as the system being distinct from the actual person working within it. And if you meet a journalist or you meet a doctor or you meet an epidemiologist and you actually talk to them about their job, they might have a lot of the same frustrations with the system and the institution as you do. Like a lot of doctors are really frustrated by the insurance system that we have. So it's not the doctors that are, being responsible for this. A lot of times they agree with a lot of the problems. So similarly to journalists who are upset about these institutions and some of the decisions they make on a more micro personal level, by getting to know them, you see like, oh, they're trying to present the truth the best that they can and they have a real passion for it. So I think that that's great that you're able to see that, and it's encouraging to see the optimism that comes from that. And that connects to the broader big picture question that I like to ask about is like, given all that we've talked about, there's these big systemic challenges, artificial intelligence being a big one that keeps popping up. What is bringing you hope in the current moment? What you talk about meeting these people, but what is there anything more that you'd like to share with people that don't have these opportunities to be in these spaces? What does bring you hope about journalism and the future of journalism?
Always joke with my colleagues and my family that every day tends to be my research agenda. When you study the news and you study news literacy and you study LGBTQ issues right now, every day is a hellscape in my life. And so most people probably think I would really struggle to find hope. And I think that's a very real assumption because I do think it's hard. But I think what's more important is that I consistently try to find joy. And I know that's semantic, but what I hope when people listen, if they take anything away from the kind of experiences I get to have, is I got to start my journey with the future. Yeah, they may be complicated and they may have a fascination with their phone that we can't understand. They may be struggling to communicate interpersonally or make decisions that we would have never made, but they're creative and they are thoughtful and they're challenging in all the ways we need them to be. And then the next stage of my career, I got to think differently about myself and I got to spend time with myself and I got to think about my community that I never got to think about before. And I got to learn that there's tremendous joy in the LGBTQ community that isn't always in the news. And I hope people can find that and see that we aren't a bunch of horrible people, that there is a tremendous amount of culture and power and happiness that has been contributed to the system. And now my career is about making the world a better place for more people than just myself or the kids that I started my career with. And that's how I find my joy every day, is that my job is not about me anymore. My job is not about them. My job is about making a better place for others to exist and finding space for those people. And that means carving my little profession, which is actually really big, and allowing myself to challenge it and to find better ways for it to think and act and behave. And it will get better. Journalism in America is currently a teenager, and we all know what we were like when we were teenagers. And I think there's some tremendous joy in thinking about journalism as an adolescent and all of the wonderful attitude and aggression and stupidity that it can be in and get in, but the tremendous amount of growth that's still to come once it's fully done with its pubescent self. And that's where I find hope and joy, that there's still a tomorrow, and tomorrow is meant to be a better version of us today. And that's what I like to think about in my work. It's meant to be a better tomorrow than it was today.
Yeah, yeah, that's beautiful, and it provides me with hope just listening to that. And I try to think similarly as far as just thinking about society and civilization also being pretty young. Like even though humans have been around not that long themselves, but just the concept of like organized structures of people in the same space, like that's all pretty new. So we're still figuring it out, and it's bumpy and it's nonlinear with progress, but there has been progress, and there has been a lot of examples of people doing tremendous things to better the spaces that we exist in. So, on that more, I'm glad we ended on an optimistic note, because I mean it's so easy to do the doom and gloom. It's almost too easy to do that these days. So I'm curious. Okay, so if people want to find your work and anything you're writing publicly, where can they do to find you these days?
So, they can find me on LinkedIn, which I can't always remember if it's Patrick R. Johnson or Patrick Raymond Johnson. I can't always remember, but I'll give you the link. Because they've essentially deleted pretty much all other socials at this point. My website is a place where I tend to keep a lot, which is prjohnson.org. And then if I write publicly, usually it's op-eds through the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel or whoever decides to take some of those things from me. I'm hoping there's a certain news org that I'm hoping will take something from this LGBTQ news avoidance report that I've got. And then I actually hope a lot of people follow Trusting News and their socials and their trust tips, because I actually think more and more people in more professions than just journalism would really learn a lot from their work.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I'll be sure to include all those links in the description and then the socials that I post this on. But yeah, Patrick, thank you so much for joining me. I've really enjoyed our conversation today.
Of course, thank you.